Have you ever wondered if the thing you spend your whole life learning still matters, now that no one seems to need it anymore? There's a certain quiet that settles over a person who once carried real responsibility and now isn't sure anyone remembers. But some lessons don't retire just because the work stops. Here's where it begins. The hand is old, spotted with age, the knuckles swollen, the skin thin as paper over veins that stand out blue and prominent. It rests against a curved piece of glass, cracked now, clouded with decades of dust, set into a wall of black iron gone the color of dried blood with rust. The glass is empty. Nothing moves behind it. Nothing has moved behind it in a very long time. Elias Bram stands alone at the edge of his land, where the last of the cultivated fields gives way to a spur of railroad track that goes nowhere anymore, swallowed at both ends by thistle and Queen Anne's lace. He is past 60 now, his shoulders rounded forward the way a man's shoulders round when he has spent a lifetime bending toward work. He does not speak. He has been standing here long enough that the shadow of the locomotive has crawled a full foot across the weeds since he arrived. Under his breath, without seeming to know he does it, he says a number. Just a number, flat and quiet, the kind of number a man might once have called out to another man standing just behind his shoulder. There is no one behind his shoulder now. There has been no fire in that engine's belly since before his own children were born. And still, his mouth remembers the shape of it. He does not explain the number, even to himself. He simply turns his palm flat against the cracked glass, the way another man might touch a gravestone. And somewhere behind his eyes, a morning 40 years gone begins, uninvited, to move again. The town of Oak Hollow in those years still kept its rhythm by 2 clocks. The church bell that marked the hour and the long, low whistle of the 6:40 freight coming down from the grain elevator. A sound so constant that mothers set bread to rise by it, and men without wristwatches trusted it more than the sun. Elias Bram was 19 that spring, all elbows and quiet nerve. 3 seasons into an apprenticeship he had half fallen into and had come, without quite admitting it, to love with the whole of his young heart. His people were farm people. His father worked 90 acres 2 miles east of the yard, corn and a little wheat, and had raised his son to expect that the boy would take up the same ground when the time came. But Elias had gone to town one autumn afternoon at 14 to deliver a wagon of his father's grain to the elevator, and he had stood transfixed at the loading dock while a black locomotive backed itself, hissing and groaning, against a line of hopper cars, and something in him had simply never come all the way back to the farm again. His father had not forbidden it. He had only looked at his son for a long moment, the way a man looks at weather he cannot change, and said that a family needed more than one kind of hands in it. Elias had never forgotten the kindness in that. The man who taught him was named Otis Ruel, foreman engineer for the Oak Hollow line, 60-some years old with a mustache gone entirely to gray and a right hand missing the last joint of its smallest finger. A story he told differently every time he told it and never told the same way twice. Otis had been putting steam engines to work since before Elias's own father was out of short pants, and there was nothing about a locomotive's temperament that had not, at some point in 4 decades, tried to kill him and failed. It was Otis who first put Elias's palm flat against the boiler jacket back in that first autumn and told him to feel it breathe. "That is what a locomotive does, boy," Otis had said. "It breathes. You learn to listen to a man breathing when he's carrying something heavy, and you learn the same with her. She'll tell you everything if you let her." Over the seasons that followed, Elias learned the whole architecture of the thing the way another boy might learn the veins and muscles of his own arm. He learned the great driving wheels, taller than a man, and the connecting rods that translated the violence of expanding steam into the smooth, relentless turning that could drag 400 tons of grain and timber up a grade that would have stalled 100 horses. He learned that the boiler was not merely a tank, but a controlled catastrophe. Water and fire kept in careful conversation through hundreds of small brass fittings, each one a promise that had to be kept exactly every single time. He learned the firebox and the particular blue-orange color a fire took on when it was fed correctly and the duller red it turned when it was starving. and how a man could read the whole state of the engine's soul in the color of its own breath rising from the stack. Otis taught him that the steel of a locomotive, for all its terrible strength, was not the true source of its power. The true source, Otis said, was the discipline of the men who understood what that steel could and could not forgive. A locomotive will pull anything you ask of her and never complain, Otis told him once, wiping grease from his ruined finger with a rag that had long ago stopped being any color but black. But she will not forgive ignorance. She has no malice in her. She only has physics, and physics does not care whether you meant well. And of all the things Otis taught that spring, there was one lesson he returned to more than any other, one he made Elias repeat back to him so many times that the boy could recite it in his sleep, and did, more than once, waking his mother in the next room. The water glass, Otis would say, tapping the curved tube of glass mounted beside the firebox door, where a visible column of water showed the boiler's true level at any moment. This is the only thing in this whole locomotive that has never once lied to a man. Gauges can stick. Ears can fool you in a loud yard. But the water glass shows you the truth, plain as your own hand in front of your face, and you will look at it, boy, more times in a shift than you look at your own mother's face in a week. And if that glass ever shows you low water, if that water line drops down toward the crown sheet, the very roof of the firebox, the one place where fire and water are separated by nothing thicker than a half-inch of iron, you do not, under any circumstance that this earth or the next can produce, pump cold water into that boiler. Otis's voice would drop when he said this, all the joking gone out of it entirely, and something older and harder would come up in its place. You dump your fire. You pull your dampers, you rake what coal you can from the box, you close every valve that feeds that fire air, and you let her cool on her own, slow, patient, no matter how badly every nerve in your body is screaming at you to do something faster. Because if that crown sheet is exposed to fire with no water above it, and you shock it with cold water all at once, that iron can buckle in an instant, and what follows is not an accident anymore. It is an explosion that will kill every man standing near it, and there will be no second chance to have done it right. Elias had nodded. That day, the way a young man nods at wisdom he respects but has not yet been asked to carry alone. He believed Otis absolutely. He had not yet understood that believing a thing and being able to act on it, alone, with no one's hand on your shoulder, were two entirely different kinds of knowing. He found out the difference on a Tuesday in late September, the air still holding the last of summer's warmth in the mornings, but turning sharp and thin by evening. Harvest weather, the kind that made every farmer in Oak County anxious to move grain before a change in the sky, could ruin a season's work in a single afternoon. There was a rush order that week, 3 farms worth of wheat that needed to reach the mill in the county seat before forecasted rain, and Otis Ruel, who had run that line without missing a single scheduled trip in 11 years, woke that morning with a fever so sudden and so severe that his wife sent a boy running to the yard before dawn to say the foreman would not be coming in. There was no one else certified to take the cab that day. The yardmaster, a heavy-set man named Corwin who did not believe in delay any more than he believed in miracles, looked at Elias for a long moment in the gray early light, the way Elias's own father had once looked at him, weighing a thing he could not entirely control. You've ridden with Otis 11 months, Corwin said finally. You know the road. You know the engine. I don't have another body who does. It has to be you, or it has to wait for rain to ruin 3 men's wheat. Elias said yes before he had entirely decided to say it. He would remember that, later, that the yes came out of him before the fear did, and that the fear arrived only afterward, climbing into the cab right behind him like an uninvited passenger, and did not leave his side for the whole of that morning. There was, before any of that fear arrived, a strange kind of privacy in the half hour before dawn, when Elias walked the length of the engine alone, doing the inspection Otis had taught him to do, without ever once being told to skip it, sick foreman or no sick foreman. He ran his palm along the great driving wheels, taller at their rim than his own shoulder, and thought, as he always thought at this hour, of how little sense it made that so much iron could move at all, let alone move with the smooth, deliberate grace this engine carried once she found her stride. The wheels themselves did no work of imagination. It was the rods, the long steel arms that connected each wheel to the piston's relentless back and forth, that turned a violent, straight-line shove of expanding steam into the perfect circular motion that could carry 400 tons up a grade no team of horses on Earth could manage. Otis had once told him that the whole design was, in its way, an act of translation, the same as a preacher turning an old and difficult truth into words a congregation could actually use. The steam did not care about wheels or grades or grain waiting at a mill. It only wanted to expand, violently, in whatever direction offered the least resistance. It was the men who built this machine, and the men who now ran it, who gave that raw violence a purpose and a direction. He checked the driving boxes for heat, the way Otis insisted a man do with the back of his bare hand rather than a gauge, because a gauge could not tell you the particular smell of a bearing about to seize the way your own skin could. He checked the sand domes, the water gauge cocks, the safety valve Otis called her conscience, only half joking because it was the one part of the whole. Engine built for no other purpose than to fail safely, to let go of pressure rather than let the boiler itself be asked to. Elias liked, in these quiet minutes, to imagine the whole locomotive as a kind of argument between forces that wanted, left alone, to destroy each other. Fire wanting always to grow, water wanting always to smother it, steam wanting only to escape in whatever direction cost at least, and the entire art of running her well was simply the art of keeping that argument civil, hour after hour, mile after mile, without ever once looking away. By the time Corwin found him at the platform with the news about Otis, Elias had already built his fire slow and even, the way he had been taught, coaxing it up through the duller reds toward that living blue-orange that meant a fire drawing exactly as it should. It was, he would think later, the only reason Corwin trusted him with the run at all. Not youth, not confidence, but the plain fact that the boy was already standing there with clean hands folded and a fire already lit correctly, as though some part of him had known, before anyone said a word, that today would ask more of him than any day before it. The locomotive that morning was patient with him in a way he would later think of as almost merciful, as though the old iron understood something about the boy that the boy did not yet understand about himself. He built his fire the way Otis had taught him, watching the color climb from dull red toward that living blue-orange that meant the fire was drawing well. He eased the throttle open with a care that made Corwin, watching from the platform, nod once and turn away satisfied. The great driving wheels found their grip on the rail, slipped once caught, and the whole tremendous weight of the engine began to move, and something in Elias's chest, some fear, some pride, he could never afterwards separate the two, rose up into his throat and stayed there. For the first hour, everything the engine did answered exactly to what he asked of it, and he began, dangerously, to relax. There was a particular stretch of straight track past the county road crossing where the land opened wide on both sides. Nothing but harvested stubble and distant fence lines. And it was there that Elias let himself, for the first time all morning, simply feel what the engine was doing beneath him rather than only manage it. He felt the rhythm of the drivers through the floor of the cab, a heartbeat many times larger than his own, steady and enormous, for 100 tons of grain and timber and iron moving because he, alone, had asked it to. He understood in that stretch of open country something Otis had told him more than once, but which he had never, until that morning, felt in his own body, that a locomotive at speed was not a machine fighting the world so much as a machine that had made a kind of peace with it, every force balanced against every other force, steam pressure against cylinder resistance, weight against grade, so that the terrible violence contained inside her became, from the outside, something almost gentle. Smoke rose straight and unhurried from the stack. The rails sang faintly beneath the wheels. A high, thin note. He had learned to listen for the way a farmer learns to listen for rain before it arrives. For a few miles, Elias Bram was not a frightened boy substituting for a sick man. He was simply a man doing the work he had been made, by some accident of temperament, to do, and he let himself, briefly and dangerously, believe that the hardest part of the day was already behind him. The engine climbed the long grade east of Miller's Creek a little past 9 in the morning, 3 hopper cars of wheat trailing obedient behind her, and it was there, with no town in sight in either direction and the nearest farmhouse a half-mile off across open stubble field, that Elias glanced at the water glass out of the same steady habit Otis had drilled into him 100 times, and felt every certainty he had built that morning drop out from under him at once. The water line was low, lower than he had ever seen it sit, even in memory, a thin sliver of visible water clinging to the bottom of the glass where a healthy reading should have shown 2/3 full. His first thought was that the glass itself had fouled, the way Otis had warned him it sometimes could, giving a false low reading through no fault of the water at all. But when he tapped it gently, the way he had been taught, the level did not jump or correct itself. It simply sat there, low and patient and entirely truthful, exactly as Otis had promised it would be. His hand went, before his mind had finished catching up to his hand, toward the injector valve, the control that would force fresh water straight from the tender's cold tank directly into the boiler. It was the obvious thing. It was the only thing that made sense to a boy whose whole body was screaming that an engine without enough water needed, immediately, more water. His fingers had nearly closed around the valve handle before something in him, not thought exactly, something underneath thought, made him stop. There's a particular kind of fear that does not look like panic from the outside. It looks instead like stillness. Elias stood in that swaying cab with his hand an inch from a valve that could save the wheat or kill him. And for 3 full seconds he did not move at all, and in the small, violent silence of that stillness, a question rose up in him that he had never once had cause to ask himself before that morning. What is the difference between the thing your body wants to do and the thing that is actually true? It is a question every person eventually meets somewhere in a life, though it rarely arrives dressed as plainly as a gauge of water and a wall of iron. Most of us are given the luxury of making our worst decisions slowly, with time enough afterward to regret and repair them. Few of us are ever asked to answer, in the space of a single breath, which voice inside us has actually earned the right to be trusted, the loud one insisting that something must be done this instant, or the quiet one saying only wait and be sure and remember what you were taught before you knew you would ever need it. Elias would spend the rest of his life, in ways large and small, discovering that the second voice was almost always the truer one, and almost always the harder one to obey. His hand came away from the injector valve. He did not pump the water. Instead, moving with a deliberateness that felt, in the moment, almost like moving through water himself, he reached for the damper controls and began pulling them closed, cutting the draft that fed his fire, and he opened the firebox door and began raking what burning coal he could reach out and away from the heart of the blaze, exactly as Otis's voice had told him to 100 times. In a kitchen and a cab and a yard he suddenly missed with an ache that had no business competing for space. With his fear, the engine slowed. Without fresh draft, the fire began, grudgingly, to die back, and the terrible mechanical breathing of the locomotive quieted by degrees, the great wheels still turning under momentum, but no longer being driven with the same violent insistence. Elias closed every valve his hands could reach, and then there was nothing left to do but wait, and waiting, he would learn that morning, was very often the hardest work a person could be asked to perform. The cab grew quiet in a way that felt unnatural after the constant roar of a fire drawing hard. He could hear individual sounds now that had been swallowed before. The tick and creak of cooling metal contracting by degrees, a sound like the engine speaking to itself in some private, aching language. Sweat had soaked through his shirt at the small of his back despite the cool morning air. He kept his eyes on the water glass and did not allow himself to look away from it, as though watching it hard enough might will the level to rise on its own, though he knew perfectly well that nothing he could do now would speed the engine's slow, unglamorous return to safety. He thought, in that long stretch of waiting, about his father's 90 acres, and about the particular quiet that settled over a farmhouse kitchen the night before a hailstorm, when there was nothing left for any man to do but sit with his hands folded and wait to learn what the sky had decided. He understood, for the first time in his young life, that his father's world and Otis Ruel's world were not, as he had once believed, entirely separate kingdoms. Both of them, in their different ways, had taught him that patience was not the absence of fear. It was simply refusing to let fear choose for you. The stubble field beyond the cab window stretched flat and gold toward a horizon empty of any other human being, and Elias found himself, in the strange suspended minutes of that waiting, noticing details he would ordinarily have had no time to notice at all. A hawk riding some high current far above the grade, unbothered by anything below it. The particular way morning light came sideways through drifting steam and broke into thin, momentary rainbows before dissolving. The sound of his own heartbeat, which he had never in his life been quiet enough or frightened enough to actually hear before. He thought of the 3 farms whose wheat sat behind him in those hopper cars, families who did not know his name and would never know how close their whole season's labor had come, that morning, to being lost along with him on an empty stretch of grade above Miller's Creek. He thought, too, though he was almost ashamed of the thought, of what his father would say if word came back to Oak Hollow that the boy had panicked and lost the engine on his very first run alone. And then, just as quickly, he set that thought aside, because Otis had taught him that fear of a thing going wrong and the discipline to keep it from going wrong were not, in the end, allies. One of them, if you let it, would only get in the other's way. 20 minutes passed before the water level began, with an almost insulting slowness, to climb back into a safe reading on the glass. Elias did not celebrate. He only exhaled once a breath he felt he had been holding since Miller's Creek, and allowed himself to sit down on the small metal seat in the corner of the cab for the first time all morning, his legs suddenly unwilling to hold him standing any longer. He brought the wheat in that afternoon, for hours behind schedule. The rain Corwin had feared arriving in a light, almost gentle drizzle just as the last hopper car was unloaded at the mill. No one at the mill knew, or ever would know, how close that morning had come to a very different ending. Otis Ruel, recovering slowly over the following week, listened to Elias's account of the water glass with his ruined hand pressed flat against his own chest, and said nothing at all for a long moment, and then only quietly that he was glad the boy had listened, and that some men went a whole career without ever finding out the hard way whether the things they'd been taught were only words. Elias Bram ran that same line for 11 more years before the railroad began its slow retreat from steam altogether, and the spur that once served Oak Hollow's grain elevator fell gradually silent, first to diesel, and then, in time, to nothing at all. He married, and farmed a portion of his father's land after all. In the end, running cattle where his father had once run corn, and he raised 2 daughters who grew up thinking of the old locomotive at the edge of their family's fields as nothing more than a curious ruin, a place to play, a thing that had always simply been there. He never told them the story of the water glass. It was not that he meant to keep it from them. It was only that some mornings do not turn easily into stories for other people to hold. They remain, instead, a private architecture inside a man, something he carries the way the locomotive itself once carried steam, pressure held quietly, doing its work unseen, asking nothing of anyone watching from outside. Now, an old man in a flannel shirt gone soft with age, Elias stands once more before the same water glass, cracked and empty and coated in the dust of 40 years, and understands at last what he could not have understood as a boy standing terrified in that cab. The lesson Otis Ruel gave him that spring was never really about steam or iron or the correct order of valves to close in an emergency. It was about the quiet, unglamorous work of becoming a person who could be trusted with something dangerous. A locomotive, certainly, but also, as it turned out, a farm, a family, a life full of moments when a loud voice inside him wanted to act first and think later, and the quiet voice, the one Otis had planted in him decades before he would ever need it, told him instead to wait and be sure. He presses his palm flat against the cracked glass. One final time, the way he has done every autumn for longer than he can now easily count, an old ritual he has never explained to anyone and does not intend to start explaining today. The metal beneath his hand no longer breathes. It has not breathed in a very long time. But something in him, some quiet certainty settled deep beneath the ordinary business of growing old, understands that what Otis gave him that spring did not stop running simply because the fire went out. It only changed shape, the way steam changes shape, and kept moving, silent and unseen, through every year that came after. He thinks, standing there with his hand still resting against the cold glass, of his granddaughter, who had asked him once, with the easy directness of a child, why he kept coming out to look at an old broken train that did not even run anymore. He had not had a good answer for her that day, and had told her only that some things were worth visiting even after they stopped moving. She had accepted this the way children accept most things adults say, without full explanation, and had run off toward the barn, and Elias had stood exactly where he now stands, turning the question over in a way he had not managed to turn it over in front of her. The truth he understands now, watching the low sun catch the last unrusted edge of a brass fitting near the cab door, is that the engine was never really the thing he came back to visit. It was Otis's voice, still living somewhere in him, still capable of steadying his hand on mornings far removed from any locomotive at all. The year the bank had nearly taken the farm, and every instinct in him had wanted to sell in a panic. The night his younger daughter had run a fever so high the doctor himself had looked frightened, and every part of Elias had wanted to do something, anything, immediately, rather than wait the long, terrible hour it took for the medicine to do its slow and proper work. Each time, some old and patient part of him had said the same thing the water glass had once said to a terrified boy of 19. Wait, and be sure. Do not let the loudest voice be the one that. Besides, Elias turns at last, and walks back toward the house, leaving the old engine standing exactly as it has stood for decades, patient and rusting and entirely unbothered by whether anyone remembers what it once was. The late afternoon light settles over the black iron the color of a dying fire, and somewhere behind him, in the tall grass grown up thick around the silent wheels, a red-winged blackbird calls once, and is answered, and the field falls quiet again. Where are you watching from tonight? And have you ever had a moment like Elias, alone with a decision no one else could make for you, when the loudest instinct wasn't the right one to trust? Tell us below. We read every single one. See you in the next story.